Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Matt Bose. I'm the general manager at New West, and with me today is Sid Marty, author of Old Man's River, New and Collected Poems. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things are warming up here, and Poetry Month, it's April. So this book is coming out in May, I believe, but you can probably get a sneak peek at it on our website. But this is a collected works book of your stuff, Sid. So going back to the 60s, we've got three of your out of print collections, and then we have kind of a miscellany of new stuff and things that didn't find a home elsewhere. So, what was it like kind of reviewing your work for this collection?
Well, quite onerous. Digging back through a lot of hard copies and humiliating at times, surprising at other times.
That wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but so like
Yeah.
faced with yourself as a younger author, did you feel like, man, this kid doesn't know what he's doing, or what was that sort of like?
Well, in some cases, yeah. In some cases, I was uh, happily surprised by the quality of some of the stuff I was doing when I was a mere stripling of 20 years of age, I guess, at Sir George Williams University in Montreal. Um, I did publish a few things when I was in university in the university magazine, of course, and I had my first poem published in a serious literary periodical, the Canadian Forum, at that time, which indicated to me a path forward, because I'd never had that experience of being accepted at that level before.
And
Yeah.
your first book was with McClellan and Stewart, right? Talk about
Yeah.
publisher in the 60s that was really kind of pushing the boundaries and really getting Canadian literature out there, hey?
Um, a really wonderful publisher. And in that era, you brought out a book of poems, which I did with McClellan and Stewart. That was after having poems accepted in a couple of literary anthologies while I was still a sophomore, and came to the attention of Al Purdy. And so he published me in an anthology called Storm Warning, which was an anthology of younger poets. That brought me to the attention of John Newlove at McClellan and Stewart, who invited me to submit a manuscript of poems. That doesn't happen very much anymore because publishers are flooded with hundreds, if not thousands, of manuscripts. You don't need to bother inviting anybody to do things. The
Especially
thing
if you
that
came off of just like one, or like if you're published in this anthology, like it's not all your work. So you were kind of singled out, like, yeah, this guy's got they want to see what else you've got. So you didn't even have a full manuscript then, I'm guessing.
No, I didn't. I didn't. I had to write that. I didn't have that manuscript written. So it was suddenly the reality of trying to write seriously really hit me, and I had to produce the book. Um, the wonderful thing about being published by McClellan and Stewart was Jack McClellan would send his authors on a tour, and even lowly poets such as myself were sent basically from Victoria all the way to Montreal,
Hmm.
even further if you thought there was interest on the East Coast. So this brought the book a great deal of attention and got it reviewed very widely
Hmm.
in the popular press. And we had some serious book reviewers at that time, like William French of the Globe and Mail. And when he gave it the sort of kiss of approval, that was a big deal
Hmm.
in Canada at that time. Yeah, so that was quite amazing. And they did my next book, Nobody Danced with Miss Rodeo, as well. But then times changed at McClelland and Stewart, and there was an emphasis on, I guess, cultural diversity, on I don't know, other issues, other social issues,
Hmm.
and people like me, although I continued to publish nonfiction with McClelland and Stewart, but wound up looking elsewhere for publishers. And eventually, of course, I was fortunate enough to be accepted by New West, for
Yeah,
which I'm quite grateful.
a couple of years later, right?
Yeah, quite a few years later,
Yeah.
decades later. Yeah.
Did you find when you were looking at your old stuff, like you were kind of using the poetical style of the day? Like, do you feel things feel a little bit dated to you, or do you see your own Sid Martiness coming through right even in the '60s?
I don't think some of the political stuff I tried my hand at that time did not come off very well. It was pretty overwrought. There was a lot of
Hmm.
emotion at the time, a lot of anti-war stuff going on.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
'68. I mean, think about Paris and
yeah,
just yeah, like that would be you would want to be tapped into the politics at that time, I think.
I was very much so, but I found that I was not writing about it very successfully.
Hmm.
I was more in the lyric mode. I was more in the um, uh, thinking in terms of poets like John Donne
Hmm.
and sort of the British canon, I guess, at that time. And that was what was interesting me, the lyric mode, more
Hmm.
than the polemical mode. I've written some polemical stuff since then, which I think is much more successful. But I think I was immature politically at that time.
Well, everyone is when they're 20. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've since written very eloquently about environmentalism and conservation, and really recently about like the conservatives wanting to mine coal in the mountains again. So, I mean,
Yeah.
you've kept that streak alive in your nonfiction for sure.
Yeah, that was very much the case with the nonfiction books. I found my métier with the environment and conservation issues. It's true. Yeah.
Hmm. Did you find that maybe like your early stuff being at what is now Concordia, right? Like being in the city, did you have to get back out to the wilderness to kind of commune with your muse? Is that where it was?
Well, I didn't know that my muse was in the wilderness at that time. I thought my muse was in Montreal.
Hmm.
So uh, I was quite in love with Montreal at that time. I'd come from Alberta and
Hmm.
had been accepted at Sir George Williams University and was immediately thrust into a milieu where Leonard Cohen would be walking down my street, um, eating an apple one moment, and the next moment I would be in a class with his mentor, Irving Layton.
Hmm.
At the same time, other poets came through every week to read. Allen Ginsberg came, Jerome Rothenberg came, a whole host of American and Canadian poets came along. George Bowering was writer in residence for a time. So it was, I was just thrust into this cosmopolitan milieu,
Hmm.
um, come from the prairies to that. And I was just like a sponge, I think, soaking up all of these inspirations. At the same time, I was playing gigs in Montreal because I had been a folk singer and songwriter, and I was playing gigs in the clubs like the Blue Lantern, the New Penelope, the Montreal Folk Workshop, the Yellow Door Coffee House,
Hmm.
and surrounded by musicians, great musicians like Willie Dunn, the Micmac singer songwriter,
Hmm.
and other people of that ilk. So it was a world of music and poetry, and I wasn't really thinking about the out of doors very much, although that would be where I would eventually find my poetic home.
Mhm.
I wrote at least one poem at that time, which sort of reflects that. Yeah, so it was a very cosmopolitan thing, a very important time for me. It was the best possible place in Canada that I could have been at that particular moment.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of like that Greenwich Village, New York scene as well. Like,
Yeah,
politics and art and intermixing French and English and yeah,
yeah,
indigenous people coming onto the scene. Uh, Buffy St. Marie would have been around then too, right? Like it was really one of the most important sites in Canada, and you were there on the ground floor. So, what made you want to leave then?
well, I graduated from university. I did go back to Sir George again, and I graduated in the centennial year, 1967, BA. But then I decided to go on to graduate school. I had an insane idea that I would make my career as a university professor and writer. And so I went back to Sir George with my new wife, Myrna, in 1969 to do the honors equivalent in English. And then from there, I went to graduate school at University of Calgary for a year. But I decided academe was not for me, and I dropped out. Didn't finish, and went on to the park warden service, where I had
Mhm.
first started working in the summer of 1966. So it became clear to me when I was at graduate school that my heart was really in the mountains, where
Mhm.
I spent my 4 or 5 months every year, and that's where I belonged. So I went from there to full-time employment with the Park Warden Service.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mostly know, I mean, I have some family who live in Jasper, but I mostly know about the, you know, middle of the century Park Service through a book called 50% of Mountaineering by Willie Pfister. And he
Yeah,
was coming at
Willie.
it.
Yeah, yeah, Willie
Did,
was.
did you know him?
He was one of my instructors in
Yeah,
mountain rescue and mountaineering, ski mountaineering, mountain rescue,
yeah.
avalanche control. Yeah, so I did know Willie, and he was a legendary figure for
Hmm.
myself and my colleagues at that time.
There's a story I like to tell where when because Susie Pfister, his daughter, is the one who put the book together. It was kind of based on a slideshow he'd do at Lions clubs and stuff of his adventures. And to try and ingratiate myself with the Jasper audience, I said, "Well, I also climbed a mountain today before I came to this book launch. It was Mount Hibernia, which I don't know if you know that one, but it's basically a hill.
Yeah,
It's no great shakes, but I got some laughs out of the crowd, which is kind of what I was aiming for.
yeah,
But mountain people who live in the parks even are they're different. It's I find it's a more relaxed sort of atmosphere. Um, People
yeah.
kind of come and go as they please, and it's a place where you could be eccentric. Not that I'm saying that you were, but definitely like it gravitates towards people who don't really want to fit in a city, right?
To a certain extent, although Canmore is growing so bloody much, basically
Yeah.
becoming a city. So, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. I've met people who've moved there for that very reason, get away from places like Toronto and stay in the mountains full time. And some of them are people who read my books, and that's why they moved there.
Wow. That's
But
got to be kind of almost intimidating. Like, you like my book that much that you moved here?
well, that has happened, yeah, and
Huh.
I've been quite humbled by a number of letters over the years from people who said, after reading your books, I decided to take up a career as a fish and wildlife officer, or I decided to go into environmental law
Wow.
because I feel like I can make a difference there. Letters like that, yeah. So, and that's a quite touching, yeah,
It's
really.
kind of amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So at this time you're still writing poetry, but also you're writing, some nonfiction that's a little bit critical of the Park Service. Did you find it difficult to maybe looking back on this, like, do you find you're in a nonfiction mode sometimes versus a poetry mode, or are you just doing everything all at once?
Tended to be doing everything at once, but because I've basically made my living since about 1978 as a prose writer,
Hmm.
um, then the necessities of deadlines means that I got to be spending time at prose to get things done.
Hmm.
So that cuts into the time for writing poetry because I find poetry equally probably more demanding, and I tend to
Hmm.
revise my work pretty extensively, so I need to spend time at it. So yeah, I think it sort of decreased my output a little bit as far as the poems went over the years. That's why it was quite a joy to just concentrate on this book and get the stuff to the editor, to Kit Dobson, and keep the thing moving forward.
Yeah, because it feels like you didn't really have a ton of time just to be able to just knuckle down and do poetry for a year, right? Like you're writing
Yeah.
articles and you're also a singer songwriter. You're just a busy guy.
Well, yeah. The thing that keeps me also busy is trying to maintain the place where I live because there was a pretty old building when we moved in, and I'd like to say that it's basically been falling down around my ears for 50 years. I keep propping it up. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's a lot of maintenance that goes on. If you People think that country living is idyllic, and it is idyllic if you're rich. Um, but if you're not, then you have an awful lot of work to do, maintaining buildings and fences, and if you have livestock, then you've got to look after them too. So that's
Hmm.
been quite demanding.
Did
And
you do you kind of in the back of your brain while doing work like that? Do you have a poem brewing, or is it kind of you know got to sit down and work it out, or like how do you come up with them? I guess.
yeah, that will happen. You know, you'll find yourself something will come to you when you're doing things like working with a chainsaw, or and when I don't have horses anymore, finally we finally parted company with the horses, but I would have to trim their hooves and doctor them and look after them. So you'd get ideas doing these various things.
Hmm.
There's a poem in there called um, it's a poem about that very thing, about trimming the horse's feet, and he seems to be trying to turn into an elk because his hooves keep splitting, and I keep trying to keep them together.
You
Yes,
probably don't. You probably don't know this, but on the social media platform TikTok, there's actually uh, kind of a scene of people who do like farrier work and like deal with hoof problems, and
yeah.
people find it relaxing to watch.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's you know it seems a little bit violent, but really it's just like a really big fingernail. But people like to watch and learn about issues that ungulates deal with, I guess.
Well,
But yeah,
it's
you
not
you could
exactly.
you could start a fourth career as a TikTok
Yeah,
star if you start
yeah.
if,
It's not
if
actually relaxing working on horses' feet. Well, with some horses it is. Some of them they're so relaxed that they almost fall asleep on you, and
uh,
others are on the fight all the time. So yeah, it's not really relaxing to do.
you could tell by these farriers' arms are like just super veiny and tan. Like, oh, this guy's outside all day long, and he could break me, a city boy, in half. But like, yeah,
Yeah,
it only looks calm because this guy's got decades of experience and super
yeah,
strong. So,
that's right.
but
Yeah, but
so,
it's pleasurable to watch an expert working on horses,
yeah,
especially when all you have to do is stand there and hold the halter and don't have to actually do it yourself.
yeah, I find it interesting when you're watching them. like they adhere like a plastic patch to one side of the hoof. This is more for cows, I think. They put a plastic patch on one side so that the horse can kind of keep whatever issue it's got off the ground. But there's like it's always just filthy. But
Yeah.
they come up with interesting ways of helping these horses out. Anyway, but poetry. Go back to poetry.
Yeah.
So um, I thought of a funny name for this book about three-quarters of the way through the process. I never ran it by you, but like not my first rodeo, I think would be a good one because this is definitively not your first one. This is quite a few
No.
down the road.
Yeah.
But like, how does it feel to have like a collected works like this, saying like, here's all my stuff for someone to look at and find connections between different eras of your work? Is that
Yeah. Yeah.
something appealing to you?
Yeah. It is good because it keeps the poems which are in out of print editions, that puts them back into print, and it's an attempt to connect uh, the writing of my younger days with what I'm doing right up to basically 2022 or 2021. I'm not sure
Mm,
what was the last poem in this book, but probably right up there, 2022.
yeah.
So it's pretty up to date that way. And there were a number of poems that had been languishing that hadn't been published, as well as newer ones. So it was good to put it all together. Um, and I'm already thinking in terms of more books. So I'm not done yet, but uh, it's
Good.
to date anyway. It's up to
Yeah.
date.
Well, that's I mean, I think that's great. I wouldn't want you to think, oh, poetry's done. I don't need to do it anymore. I got them all
No.
here. No, it's good that it just spurs you on to maybe think about some more stuff now that you could kind of point to, volume one. Oh, here's all that.
Yeah.
Do you feel if you're working or thinking about poems right now, do you feel like there's a split between all of these books and the way you're thinking now, even if, the what was called Bull Pine Courage when you sent it to us, but the newer ones, do you see a split now that you've um, gone through your whole back catalog, and do you want to try and change things up, or are you going to try and do similar stuff?
Well, I might try and take a different tack. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've been interested in a few things. I've been interested in the idea of a book of rhyming poems,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I've been interested in the idea of a book that is thematically consistent throughout. And that would probably be a shorter book, but
Mm-hmm.
um, these poems are pretty wide ranging. There
Yeah.
are some ongoing consistent themes, but they range pretty widely.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that interest, and in the rhyming poems too. I think maybe we're
Mm-hmm.
at a moment where I really think we need in poetry to connect poets with a wider audience,
Mm-hmm.
um, other than academics. Where poetry has become too much of a bead game for insiders, and time and again I'll hear from people who've read my prose books. Oh no, I don't read poetry. I can't be bothered reading that stuff. This is an unfortunate attitude that's out there. I'm not sure how you overcome it, but it would help if we uh, keep the reader in mind somewhat when we're writing poetry, which I think is something I often or mainly do. I would like people to read my stuff and basically to understand it or to enjoy it. I'm not writing this stuff to show to a couple of people in a creative writing class.
Yeah.
Uh, so I have a wider audience in mind.
There's only so much recursiveness that you can have between someone writing specifically for the academy to make more MFAs who come out and then write things for themselves. Like can be very insular. So it's good to write about topics that normal people might find interesting, let's say.
Yeah, that's one thing for sure.
Yeah. And,
Yeah,
linking it to a love of the outdoors. I mean, that goes back
yeah,
to romantic poets. It goes back to Homer. Like everyone is always interested in new ways of finding out interesting environments. So
yeah.
that's a through line through
It's
all
a
of
through
Western
line through
civilization.
all the, yeah, it's a through line through all poetry,
Hmm.
and very much so with the whole English canon all the way um, from Chaucer forward and before
Yeah.
him, as you say, to Homer. Yeah,
Yeah. I think a lot of people just got the sort of idea that it's all very self indulgent and like I don't know, all women kind of like every single poem is about myself and song of myself, that sort of thing. I think that turns a lot of people off. But yeah, this is the book that's going to do it. We're going to fix everything.
yeah, yeah. We'll get everybody back to poetry.
Yeah,
Just have to read this book.
yeah. So you heard it here first.
Yeah,
You heard it here, folks. This is the one.
yeah, exactly.
So you've got a little bit of a selection of stuff for our listeners. Why don't you set that up?
Sure. Well, I mentioned that the first poem I ever wrote that was, well, the first one that was published in a serious magazine was this one when I was at Sir George Williams University. And it's called 16th Summer. And basically, it's about going out to HMCS Esquimalt when I was a sea cadet and learning how to sail. The Navy taught us how to sail. And I made a friend out there who was a very good sailor, and that's what this is about. It's called 16th Summer. The heavy breakers crumpled on the knees of jetties as we sailed past the buoy. You had the tiller and a white cloud hung on the mast, but that offshore willowaw caught me steering a greenhorn tack. Do you remember how we jumped like cats to starboard as we heeled hard over, yelling into the spray, and brought her back in time? Even now, I'm sure that you are unafraid, sure as I know you're sailing still. And all that blue day, the green hills were watching the white sea. And I was your grass country friend, swaggering up the tattooed road in brand new sneakers and borrowed pants, carrying your sailbag. I had the wind in the bag, and today the prairie grass is blowing like the sea. This was 1966 I was talking about in that poem. Later on, I had a friend, Andrew Signaski, who did what would basically qualify as Zamzidat publishing, I guess. He was inspired by the Russians, and he used to publish his friends and anybody he cared about on a mimeograph paper, put a kind of a cardboard cover on it. And one of the poems of mine that he published was a prairie poem, and a number of them were prairie poems that later wound up in an anthology of prairie poets. And this is one of them for Andrew Signaski, Lights That Go Out. Listless towns, lights that go out of the prairie night, forever as horizons clear themselves. Prairie farms with no life in them hardly leave a lasting ruin in their passage as they fail. Bands of gold in the snow, spring unveiling last year's harvest. The people have been scattered, sown to the four winds. They remember some things that were true of how they grew, and going back too often alone, find boards rotting and strange pictures from the past that illustrate the spider's rafter. They grow old in various cities where they sometimes become citizens. How we cut the tender roots using a needlessly heavy axe. Then sitting in the topmost branches of your starry tree, you can say now, I am that citizen of new worlds I've discovered, having arrived on a ladder of dreams, which is now lying broken in a yellow field of drought-struck wheat. I mentioned Al Purdy and John Newlove and McClellan Stewart, and I should read one of the poems that got published in Headwaters, my first book of poems. Came out with McClellan Stewart in 1973. It was Tom Wayman who pointed out the other day, you realize that it's been 50 years since you published Headwaters, your first book of poetry, which was mind-blowing, but this year is the anniversary of that. This poem is called Sigh Washing. It's devoted to Al Purdy. Sigh washing is a term for traveling on horseback through untracked mountainous terrain. That's a kind of a Westernism. This is what I would do if the down timber stretched to the sky. Sigh washing, my mind on a jumping horse, toward a sunset, not only breaking down but torn away. Riding for the ragged curtain is what I do, born 50 years too late. Will not get used to dying on a cushioned seat, rolling down my gray tomorrows. So I ride these mountains through the widowmakers, carrying away old snags that catch on my leather. Had I fringes, I would wear them to all torn up by timber to flash in the shin tangle. Call it sigh washing, what we do out here when we need to go through places that do not seem desirable. I weeping, hat gone, one spur broken, saddle gun catching on limbs, half unsaddled, the pony mad, and flies would eat your socks. And it feels like a saga. So it is. To live your own story is no lie. It feels strong, it burns the loins, the sun's whip-like motion through the spruce. Here is a cliff edge, there is a muskeg hole, there is the track of a bear. Twist, dodge, turn archaic, half-forgotten skills to service. When the old ones all are gone, you must teach it to yourself. And sigh washing, that all-consuming art, was good enough for me. In 1981, I came out with another book of poems with McClellan Stewart, this one called Nobody Danced with Miss Rodeo. And this poem is called In the Dome Car of the Canadian, which dates me. I traveled across this country many times on that train. In the dome car of the Canadian, the Down syndrome boy is astounded with joy at terrific white-fanged mountains. The shining makes him cry aloud. Tunnels through stone to him are mysteries, are happy as the womb, and equally happy to him alone, embraced by folly's equanimity, was his birth in this bright world. He claps his hand over his mouth and moans with ecstasy, to be swallowed whole again, then born into the glimmering light. These boats along the Fraser, trailing their glistening sweepers of logs along the river, are arcs of all creation rocking on the dappled water. O passengers, you travelers may strain your eyes to blindness, but never again you'll see what he is seeing as he dances in the aisles for joy. Yeah, I was deeply moved by that little guy, and he did dance in the aisles of the dome car with excitement and pleasure. This is called Ballad of the Onion, for an editor briefly encountered. At lunch we ordered salad, serene and spare of build. She gazed upon the legumes while her water glass was filled. But she edited the onions like unwanted exclamations from the paragraphs of lettuce and the carrot's explications. She asked to see some poems. I read for her that night. The verses stripped me naked. I was blinded by her light. But she left the crowded room with a speed that seemed rehearsed. It must have been the onions stinking up the verse. A letter came today. Her writing is so neat. Reminds me of the way she nibbles vegetables sans meat. She sent me back my poems. Try again someday. We only use postmodern, and rhyming is passé. I still can smell the perfume of this literary seer, who condescend to smile when she'd prefer to sneer. Her pearly teeth, her crimson nails, once pierced me to the core. But many a beast that chews a leaf has the heart of a carnivore.
So, a selection of poems from Sid Marty's collected works, Old Man's River. Uh, it's coming out May 15th, so you could pre-order it on our website right now or at your favorite local bookstore.
Right.
Thanks again for coming on the show, Sid.
Thank you.
This is Matt Bose from New West Press signing off.